Welcome, everybody. I'm Michael Rugel from the National Museum of American Jewish Military History. Pleasure to be here today with Rabbi Joseph Topek. Today's program is presented as a part of our Alan S. Brown Scholar Series. Alan S. Brown proudly served his country for 23 years as a U.S. naval officer and was a dedicated veteran of the Vietnam War. In memory of his dedication to community and education, we present talks from renowned scholars and authors working in the field of American Jewish military history. And Rabbi Topek has done a lot of work in the field, including ongoing research on Jewish chaplains in the Civil War and other topics. He is the Jewish chaplain at Stony Brook Medicine, the Stony Brook University Medical Center, serving the Long Island State Veterans Home and University Hospital. He is Director Emeritus of the Hillel Foundation for Jewish Life at Stony Brook University, Chaplain Emeritus in the University Interfaith Center, where he also serves as chairman and instructor in the university undergraduate colleges. Rabbi Topek holds academic degrees from the University of Texas at Austin and Brandeis University and rabbinic ordination from the Academy for Jewish Religion. He's a member of the Long Island Board of Rabbis, the New York Board of Rabbis, the Association for Jewish Studies, and the Society for Military History. He's written and lectured widely on American Jewish military history. Today, he discusses the ways the American Jewish community commemorated the Jewish service members killed in the Second World War. And we'll hear more from Rabbi Topek specifically on some of the ways that the Jewish War Veterans of the USA organization memorialized those we've lost. But one of the important ways was the creation of this museum, known today as the National Museum of American Jewish Military History. The origin of the museum is as a memorial known as the Shrine to the Jewish War Dead. In many years, that's what it was. It was a pure memorial. The building here opened when it was determined that we wanted to do more than just memorialize. We wanted to work to understand the experiences of Jews in the American military and share those stories. But memorialization will always remain at least a part of what we do here. We always want to remember those lost to war, as our exhibits and our programs help to continue to help people learn more about the history of Jews in the American military. So it's a pleasure today to have a program that kind of does both. I think it will do both these things. Before I turn it over to Rabbi Topek, just to tell people we will get to Q&A at the end. Please use the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen. You can begin submitting questions anytime, and we will get to them after Rabbi Topek's presentation. So Rabbi Topek, the floor is all yours.
Thank you, Mike. It's a pleasure to be here. And I would just second what you said, that to urge anybody who's watching this to visit the museum if you haven't, because it has wonderful exhibits and it's a wonderful resource on the subject of American Jewish military history. And I'm very appreciative to the museum for sponsoring this talk, one of many wonderful talks that the museum sponsors. Mike, if you want to put up the PowerPoint, I think we can start with that. Okay. Acheinu Anshei Hachayil, which roughly translates as our brethren men of the military, or more familiarly, our brothers in arms, was the phrase that was used in the El Mole Rachamim, the memorial prayer that had been composed by the rabbis of the Jewish Welfare Board, first in 1917, and later in editions of military prayer books and manuals during World War II. I must begin this talk with kind of an admonition that this topic is somewhat morbid, and it should be approached by historians and anyone, for that matter, with the appropriate reverence, which I am going to try my best to do. I would also note that today is during the 9 days of the month of Av, leading up to Tisha B'Av, which is this Wednesday night and Thursday, which is it's kind of the national day of mourning for the Jewish people. So maybe it's appropriate that we talk about this at this time. The memorialization of Jewish soldiers that were killed in combat actually has a long history in Jewish life, and in the United States, it dates to the earliest organization of Jewish veterans in the years following the Civil War. The Hebrew Union Veterans Association devoted a good portion of its existence to promoting Jewish participation in saving the Union and in memorializing both those killed in the war and its veterans upon their passing. This is a handwritten notice. It's one of the earliest, announcing the death of one of the members of the Hebrew Union Veterans Association. In 1905, the organization would erect a significant monument, next slide, to the Jewish dead of the Union Army in the Civil War, noting their sacrifice for the salvation of the Union. That monument stands in the cemetery of Temple Emmanuel of the city of New York, which is in its Salem Field Cemetery in Brooklyn. Following World War I, when a vastly greater number of Jews served in the U.S. Armed Forces, the Jewish War Veterans united to form, or Jewish veterans organizations, there were a couple of them, united to form what eventually became the Jewish War Veterans. They would regularly hold memorial services for Jewish personnel killed in the World War and in other conflicts, mostly on a local level at synagogues or in cemeteries. These tended to mirror the Memorial Day events that were held by secular organizations, but of course without the Christological overtones, and they had a very specific Jewish orientation. This is an example of one from 1939. But to provide some perspective, which I think we can go to the next slide, the population of the United States was about 132 million in 1940. And in the duration of the war, approximately 13 million Americans served in the armed forces. The Jewish population was just under 5 million, but approximately 550,000 American Jews served in World War II. About 9.8% of the general population served, while about 11% of the Jewish population did. And there may be reasons for that, but we're not going to discuss those today. But by 1945, the United States had suffered 405,000 killed in the Second World War, many more wounded, of course. And the American Jewish community lost 10,500 men and women in the war, or 0.21% of the population. There was hardly a Jewish community anywhere in the country that had not lost young men in the war, and the long-term loss to our community of future leaders, philanthropists, fathers, businessmen, and scholars is incalculable. For the most part, the community, like the rest of the country, tried to put the war behind them and move on, and join the post-war period of optimism, economic growth, and prosperity. As a member of the baby boomer generation, me personally, and the son and son-in-law of World War II veterans, the war was not really a topic of discussion, nor was the subject of those who were killed in the service. There were some brass plaques in the back hallways of synagogues and Hillel buildings. There were some friends who had been named for uncles or cousins that had been killed in the war, but little else. In many ways, it was the families of those who had died who were left to reconcile their deaths and mourn their loss. Still, there remains a very rich material culture of memorializing these deaths that has been mostly overlooked, and I hope that we can uncover some of it and obtain a glimpse into the losses that our community suffered and the ways in which some tried to make meaning of those deaths of these young men and women and to commemorate their lives. So the story actually begins during the war itself and how death was addressed on the battlefield and in combat zones. Most of us are familiar with what you're looking at, the ubiquitous dog tag, first issued to soldiers during World War I, but which by World War II contained an identification of the soldier's religion. Jewish soldiers were marked by the letter H for Hebrew. There are many stories of Jewish soldiers and their dog tags, particularly in the European theater, where fear of capture by the Nazis was a concern, and that was the topic of another lecture and of a significant amount of literature addressing that issue. But again, we don't have time for that today, but perhaps another time. On these dog tags that we see here displayed, one of them contains next of kin information, which was common to be on one and sometimes on both dog tags. Of course, the Army and the Navy already had this information, but if a soldier was killed and his dog tags were intact, then the next of kin dog tag could be retained and his identity confirmed for notification. Some soldiers also chose to carry personal identification devices, which you can see on the next slide, in addition to their dog tags. This is a practice that actually began during the Civil War when Army issued dog tags were not yet available. In these examples, Jewish soldiers chose devices that explicitly showed that the wearer was a Jew. In one case, even mimicking the data shown on his dog tags, including the word Hebrew. I think we can go to the next slide. In civilian life, when a Jew dies, often the family rabbi is consulted regarding proper burial practices. But during combat conditions, this is difficult, if not impossible. Sometimes corpses remained on battlefields for a considerable amount of time until they could be claimed by a division of the army called graves registration. In some cases, bodies fell into the hands of the enemy and could not be reclaimed until after hostilities had ceased. While rabbis had served as chaplains since the Civil War, World War II saw the largest number of rabbis in the service in American history, matching the largest number of Jews in uniform in American history. Many served in combat zones where the identification and burial of bodies was among their duties. Owing to an often large number of casualties and the exigencies of supplying troops with the necessities of combat, soldiers killed in battle were buried in temporary cemeteries near the battlefield. Temporary markers were constructed of wood and placed at the head of each grave, usually with the name and the serial number painted on the marker. Next slide. These markers were styled after the types of markers instituted in foreign military cemeteries after World War I, where graves were marked with either the Latin cross or the Star of David. This practice seems to have been a reflection of the protocol used by the British Army, and it was retained after the war when permanent markers were fashioned in marble for American military cemeteries in France and Belgium. It would take some years after the end of World War II for permanent foreign military cemeteries to be organized and proper markers to be placed, or, if requested by the family, for the soldier's body to be repatriated and buried in the United States. Bodies were still being returned and reinterred into the 1950s, and even today, an occasional body of a soldier who was missing in action is retrieved. I think we can go to the next slide. Here on Guadalcanal, Jewish naval chaplains join in a visit to this temporary cemetery, since the Navy provided medical personnel and chaplains to the Marine Corps, and this was a Marine Corps cemetery. The rabbis who served in these combat zones were largely unprepared to deal with the military's method of handling battlefield burials. The result actually was a body of responsa, or of rabbinic rulings from the Jewish Welfare Board concerning issues such as the position of the individual officiating at the grave, the position of the coffin, the dressing of the dead for burial, the use of a talit in military burial, the decoration of Jewish military graves, the communal recitation of Kaddish for fallen comrades, and even burial on the Sabbath. Next slide. With dozens of rabbis serving in combat zones and on bases around the world, the Jewish Welfare Board began to circulate a regular communication for chaplains. And these communications contain news as well as practical information. Yeah, on this slide. As early as February 1943, Rabbi Irving Tepper was deployed in North Africa and had been assigned as graves registration officer. Rabbi Tepper would serve on the front lines with his division through every campaign until he himself, unfortunately, was killed in France in August of 1944 by shrapnel from a German artillery shell. The Jewish Welfare Board also requested that rabbis report data to them so that accurate records of Jewish soldiers could be kept. Next slide. Jewish soldiers who were killed could be identified. Proper religious services could be provided, even if not at the time of burial. This is an example from the newsletter that went out to chaplains, giving them some instructions and actually warning them about just looking for Jewish names, about Jews who might have names that don't seem to be Jewish, and about non-Jewish soldiers who have names that might look Jewish. Even with names like Bernstein, Blumenthal, Goldberg, you never know. So the JWB, the Jewish Welfare Board, which provided a lot of resources to the rabbis, was very good at helping them to try to navigate their way through the through military protocol and do this job properly. Rabbi David Golovinsky, who was a Navy chaplain who had been ordained at Yeshiva University in 1932, recalled that while serving with the Marines at Pearl Harbor in 1945 and 46, I toured the military cemeteries to check the markings over the graves of the Jewish dead and recite the traditional prayer for the dead, the El Mole Rachamim. Since I felt that parents would be comforted in the knowledge that their son's grave had been visited by a Jewish chaplain and was marked with the proper name and a Star of David, I sent a photograph with a personal letter to each of the families concerned. How the parents actually felt about the letter and the photograph of me standing with a prayer book beside their son's grave, I had no way of knowing. So, of course, the rabbis frequently wrote to the families of Jewish soldiers, including those who were alive, but particularly those where they had been involved in the soldier's burial or had visited the grave. And actually, Golovinsky did hear years later from a couple of those parents. He ran into one at an event and he recognized his name, and it was the father of a soldier who had been killed in the Pacific, and whose grave Rabbi Golovinsky had visited, and he was very, very grateful for that. The Jewish Welfare Board also provided materials to soldiers as well as to chaplains. This publication, called Ministering to the Jews in the Armed Forces, was meant to be useful to anyone who might be in the position of accompanying a Jewish soldier to his grave. Like all Jewish Welfare Board religious materials, it was compiled by a cooperative body of Reform, Conservative, and Orthodox rabbis, an accomplishment in wartime that would likely be impossible today. Next slide. Along with the ubiquitous pocket prayer book distributed to Jewish personnel, this is an example, the prayer book itself contained the El Mole Rachamim that referred to the deceased as Acheinu Anshei Hachayil, our brothers in arms. Combat conditions made traditional burial of soldiers nearly impossible, but the efforts of the Jewish Welfare Board and the Jewish chaplains and the Army were the best that could be expected under the circumstances. The Army's primary goal is to win the war and stop soldiers from being killed. This takes precedence over religious rituals and other civilian niceties, and thus the Jewish Welfare Board advised the rabbis who were serving as chaplains, "It is our hope that when this war is over, the identification and return of Jewish war dead will be simplified, and that meanwhile, we will offer parents such religious consolation as is possible." Meanwhile, on the home front, the Jewish Welfare Board distributed registration cards to Jewish soldiers. This is an example of one, to collect data on how many Jews were serving and where in the service they were located. Families commonly placed a banner like this one in the window to show that they had a member serving in the armed forces. Many of the pre-war isolationist tendencies, as well as any pro-German sentiments, had mostly vanished after Pearl Harbor, and supporting the war effort, even at great sacrifice, was something to be proud of. The Jewish Welfare Board had been organized in 1917, at the outset of the U.S. involvement in World War I, its primary mission being to provide support for Jewish servicemen, this being the first massive enlistment of American Jews in the country's armed forces, with at least 200,000 Jews serving during World War I. In the American Expeditionary Forces, could have been as high as 250,000. An organized Jewish military chaplaincy was instituted with the vetting of rabbis by the Jewish Welfare Board, as well as a cadre of field workers who visited soldiers in camps both in the United States and in France. During the interwar years, the organization focused primarily on the Jewish Community Center movement, but with mobilizations beginning in 1940 and 1941, the JWB began to refocus on the military. The even more massive mobilization of World War II, which would see well over 500,000 American Jews in uniform, would also enlist 311 rabbis in the military chaplaincy, and the Jewish Welfare Board would bring other support services to soldiers as well as to military families. This is an example of a letter that came from the Jewish Welfare Board to the mother of a Jewish soldier who was killed. The Veterans Service Committee would provide support services to military families, as you can see from this rather sad letter, often particularly for immigrant parents of lost soldiers. Assistance in navigating the military bureaucracy was invaluable in recovering personal effects and eventually their loved one's body. The synagogue, which was long the primary local Jewish organizational body in the United States, also supported families with members in uniform, and many had their own material way of acknowledging their service. These examples of banners and plaques were quite common in congregations across America, and some of them survive to this day. Generally, they listed all the members of the congregation or their children who were serving in the armed forces, and had a special indication for those who were killed. Some followed the military's Gold Star designation, and some used other forms of notation, such as a wreath. On this banner, which is from the Beth Jacob congregation of Duquesne, Pennsylvania, a suburb of Pittsburgh, each member's name is hand embroidered on the banner. They're not in alphabetical order, since the names were added as enlistments grew during the war. One name is designated with a gold star, Lieutenant Daniel Colton, who was killed in action in France on November 16, 1944. Can go to the next slide, please. Lieutenant Colton's family would relocate a few miles away to Pittsburgh, and there they would dedicate this yahrzeit plaque in his memory. Ironically, the dedication with his own name reads Itzik Daniel ben Eliezer Leib, the 30th of Mar Cheshvan. That was the day he was killed. Mar Cheshvan is often used to describe the Hebrew month of Cheshvan with the descriptive Mar, which means bitter. The reason is because it doesn't contain a single Jewish holiday. Of course, for this family, Cheshvan became a bitter month for another and very tragic reason. Another Beth Jacob congregation, this one, hundreds of miles away in Houston, Texas, would hang a similar hand-sewn banner in its lobby. This one is 9 feet long and 5 feet wide, and it was actually found in the garage of the daughter of a former member years after the synagogue had merged with others to form the United Orthodox Synagogue in Houston. My family actually belonged to Beth Jacob, and thus the names of my father and 4 of my uncles and several cousins each have a star on this banner. There are 220 stars, including several gold stars, one of which was for Private Melvin Sewell, who was killed on October 29, 1944 in Belgium. Beginning as a service flag in 1942, the banner was formally dedicated in March 1945. Fortunately, it was rescued, and it's now part of the Houston Jewish History Archives at Rice University, where it has undergone extensive restoration and preservation. My father was the second to the last living veteran whose name was on the flag until he died at age 98 last April. And I believe since then, the other remaining World War II veteran whose name was on there also passed away. Next slide. Congregation Ohav Shalom in Washington Heights, which was a German refugee synagogue, commissioned this plaque that gave special designation to the 4 members who were killed in action inside of a wreath. This has been preserved by the Leo Baeck Institute, which is located at the Center for Jewish History in New York. The organized Jewish community had more than one reason for documenting the service of Jews in the armed forces. Besides providing them with support services, the community wanted to document what American Jews had done to support the war effort. In an era when anti-Semitism was rife, not such a foreign concept to us any longer, one of the chief accusations against Jews was that they were not loyal citizens and they could not be counted upon in a crisis. These had been the main charges leveled in the 19th century that led to the founding of the Hebrew Union Veterans Association, the publication of Simon Wolf's book, The American Jew as Patriot, Soldier, and Citizen in 1895. Add to that the pre-war isolationist ideology, the Depression, the commonly heard canard that the war was really about the Jews who were dragging the United States into the conflict, and a serious motive was provided for the community to prove the Jews had sacrificed as much, if not more, than the rest of the country. Between 1945 and 1947, the Jewish Welfare Board compiled statistics on Jewish service during the war and published a 2-volume book titled American Jews in World War II, documenting not only the numerical statistics, but the name of each American Jew who died in the service or received any sort of military decoration, including the Medal of Honor, the Distinguished Service Cross, Silver Star, Bronze Star, Purple Heart, Presidential Unit Citation, or any foreign decoration, like the Croix de Guerre. The Jewish war veterans also published books about Jewish participation in the war, often featuring profiles of Jewish war heroes, both living and dead. In 1946, they produced a pageant, which this is a photo from, in Madison Square Garden, called The Fighting Jew, that covered Jewish participation in all of the wars of the United States and included this scene of graves marked with Stars of David among the Latin crosses, a clear iconographic image of the Jew as a loyal fellow citizen among his Christian neighbors. Individual families, however, were left to grieve in their own way. You can go to the next slide, please. Some chose, similar to the Colton family in Pittsburgh, to dedicate a Jewish material object in memory of their lost soldier son. This simple invitation announced a Siyum HaSefer, or the completion of a Torah, in memory of Private George Silver of Brooklyn at Congregation Pre-Eitz Chaim in 1945. Of some interest is the fact that his family chose to have his body repatriated after the war, but they had him buried in a domestic military cemetery rather than in a Jewish cemetery. His headstone is an example of the religious designation that is utilized in domestic military cemeteries administered by the Veterans Administration, where the Star of David is one of now several religious options offered to families on the uniform-shaped tablet, tablet-shaped headstone, which is what you can see on the right here. So if you go to a veterans cemetery here in the United States, all of the headstones, unless it's only a footstone, look like this, as opposed to, I'm sure you've seen photos, and I know there was one on the opening slide, and we'll see another one in a few minutes, of the markers that are used in foreign military cemeteries. Those are administered by the American Battlefield Monuments Commission, and there it's either a Latin cross or a Star of David, which is the entire marker. We'll talk about that in a minute. In American military cemeteries on foreign soil, as I just mentioned, if we can go to the next slide, the monuments are the more familiar Latin cross and the Star of David as shown here. These marble markers replace those temporary wooden markers that we saw in previous photos once the permanent cemeteries were established in the years after the war ended. In some cases, Jewish soldiers were mistakenly buried under a Latin cross. There were many reasons why this happened, sometimes due to simple error, some because Jewish soldiers had either hidden their identity or they wore a dog tag that did not have an H on it. This cross was the military's default marker when religion was unknown or unclear. In recent years, an organization called Operation Benjamin has taken upon itself to rectify these errors and work closely with the American Battlefield Monuments Commission to change the crosses to Stars of David on mismarked Jewish graves. And this is one example of a successful redesignation that occurred in 2020 at the Manila American Cemetery in the Philippines. And I can't say enough about what a wonderful job that Operation Benjamin is doing, and that, you know, when history is wrong, it's our job to try to correct it. And this not only corrects the record that these Jews were mistakenly buried under a cross, but it also does something very important for the soldier and for his family. And many times families attend these rededications of the new marker of the Star of David, and many of them are very, very moved by this. And of course, they've helped to provide documentation and documentary evidence to Operation Benjamin so that they can get the American Battlefield Monuments Commission to make this change. But they have done an absolutely stellar job of doing this. And They deserve every bit of support that we can give them and any bit of help that we can give them in rectifying these mistakes. Families who opted for burial in a Jewish cemetery chose their own markers, and there's many examples. This one is particularly interesting. Corporal Meyer Wilkes of Dayton, Ohio, was killed in action on the island of Biak in New Guinea on June 12, 1944. His body was repatriated after the war, and his family listed the location of his death, the Army Air Corps unit that he served with, and included the Army Air Corps insignia of the wing propeller on his headstone. He's actually buried only a few rows away from my father-in-law, who was also a corporal in the Army Air Corps. But he was stationed in CBI, China, Burma, India. In addition to to the military headstones, there's some other examples of material commemoration of Jewish soldiers, even from non-Jewish sources. Jews were often members of secular organizations, and here's an example of a Jewish Elks Lodge member from Los Angeles whose family was presented with this medal to commemorate his death in the war. Families of deceased soldiers who were killed in combat were also presented with a Purple Heart, which you can see on the next slide, as a posthumous award. The Purple Heart, of course, is awarded to any military personnel who were injured or killed in action against an enemy of the United States. This one was awarded to a Jewish soldier from the Bronx, whose name was Murray Margulies. As mentioned earlier, 6 Jewish chaplains lost their lives during the war, 3 of them in action. Perhaps the best known was Rabbi Alexander Good, who perished on the troop ship Dorchester, February 3rd, 1943, in the North Atlantic. It was documented by many survivor accounts that the torpedoed ship went down with Rabbi Good joining with the 3 Christian chaplains, 1 Catholic and 2 Protestant, to distribute life jackets, calmed the panicked soldiers, and helped them to lifeboats, and even gave up their own life jackets. It was reported that the 3 of them linked arms in prayer as the ship went into the sea. There's a 4 Chaplains Foundation and chapel, and in 1948, a special postage stamp and cover was issued to commemorate their heroism. Each posthumously received the Purple Heart as well as the Distinguished Service Cross, which is the 2nd highest military honor that can be awarded. Marking the graves of veterans is a practice that dates to the Civil War and what was first called Decoration Day, which later became Memorial Day. The Jewish version of this was instituted by the Jewish war veterans, and first on the graves of World War I soldiers, and now on the graves of all Jewish veterans, generally in Jewish cemeteries, and also in military cemeteries as well. The 6.5-inch heavy brass disc, also produced in a slightly smaller and lighter aluminum version, is affixed to a stake. You can see on the back it has these rings for putting it on the stake, and is topped by an American flag and placed adjacent to the headstone. The Jewish war veterans, which in various incarnations succeeded the Hebrew Union veterans and the Hebrew veterans of the war with Spain, is organized like secular veterans organizations into local posts. Next slide. Beginning in the 1920s, it was common to name these posts for prominent Jewish veterans or those who had been killed in war. Following World War II, not only did the organization grow dramatically and founded several new posts, but sadly, it was also provided with a harvest of new names of Jewish soldiers who had been killed in the war. These are a few examples, including the cap of a Jewish war veterans Lady Auxiliary member in a post named for Lieutenant Frances Slanger, the first Army nurse to be killed in the European theater. She was from Boston, so you see it's located in Roxbury, Massachusetts. Other Jewish organizations and agencies that had members in the war also commemorated their participation or their deaths. In this example, the Hebrew Sheltering Guardian Society, which operated a school in Bronxville, which is New York, part of the Bronx, New York City, had hundreds of alumni. And in 1944, they published a war service cavalcade on the occasion of a banquet and erected a plaque that tallied the number of their alumni who were serving. The Jewish war veterans, often in cooperation with synagogues, B'nai B'rith lodges, or Gold Star parents, continued to commemorate World War II losses well into the 1960s. Next slide. In these examples, individual names of Jewish personnel who died in the war from a particular city or state are listed. This one shows all the Jewish soldiers who lost their lives from Atlantic City, New Jersey. Next slide. This one is from Wilkes-Barre, Pennsylvania, and about 2/3 of the name on the list are soldiers who were killed in World War II. The others were from World War I. This particularly poignant example on the next slide is from Detroit, Michigan in 1950. It was a memorial that was held with Gold Star parents. And as you can see, it has a very long list of Jewish soldiers from Detroit who were killed in the war. Next slide. This one, which is from Milwaukee, Wisconsin, also has a fairly long list of those who were killed. And in some ways, seeing these lists helps us to grasp the impact that the war had on these communities. Surely everyone in these Jewish communities knew someone who had lost a son or a brother in the war. Next slide. This pin was produced by the Jewish war veterans many years after the war, likely in the 1980s, to try to keep alive the memories of these soldiers. Even without dwelling on the reasons that wars are fought and principles for which soldiers make their sacrifices, we can still appreciate what this loss meant to their families and their communities. These material objects reflect the individual, the familial, and the communal need to mourn their deaths and to preserve their memories. Many of them are touching in their simplicity, and they evoke a sadness that so many young members of the Jewish community gave their lives in the war. I wonder, I think many of us do, we wonder what contributions that they would have made. How many more baby boomers like me might be here today had many from our father's generation survived the war. Each of these objects is a part of the material culture of American Jewry, and it helps to tell our story. Some of these stories are about allegiance to a country that provided safety and opportunity, but nevertheless reflected an individual's status as a member of a religious and an ethnic minority. Some of them demonstrate the individual's participation in the military as an American, but reflect their distinction as Jews. Perhaps these objects are the only things left that give some voice to these departed. What the objects can teach us and what they can tell us is that each one of them was a son, daughter, husband, wife, sibling, cousin, or friend, and of course that their lives had meaning and that their deaths were very, very tragic. So I think I'm going to stop there and give the opportunity under Michael's direction for any of you who have questions that you would like to ask to do so.
Yeah, please do use the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen to submit some questions. So we've got a few already. George Levine, my uncle died in World War II and was Jewish. How may I have his name remembered in the museum? So I guess I can address that one. We do have several programs, including a Yahrzeit program, which you can see on a website anywhere around the world. We have inscribed pavers where people memorialize those lost in war in front of the building. We have an memorial wall inside the building where people put the names of those we lost. We have Our Heroes photo kiosk, so several programs where you can. And if you have his materials, archival materials, photographs, things like that, you can consider submitting them for our archives, where they'll be available for researchers, for us, for our exhibits, for our programs, online materials, all types of things along those lines. Here's one from Mindy Solkin. My dad served in World War II and earned the Croix de Guerre medal for heroism that is in my possession. He did not die in the war because of the fire at the Army Records building in St. Louis in 1973. It's very hard to get info as to why he received it. I've researched a lot and know it was awarded to a unit. Do you have any further info? Any advice for researching a Croix de Guerre that they don't know much about, and like many of the records burned up from the National Archives Military Personnel Record Center?
Yes, actually, if you put up the very, very last slide, it has my email address on there. And if you email me, I can certainly help to point you. Yeah. I can help to point you in the direction of some resources, and I'm even happy to do a search myself among some resources that I have to see if I can find more information for you. So drop me an email and I'll be happy to help you out.
Okay. An anonymous question. Thank you for this wonderful presentation. What was the name of the 2-volume book which included the names of all Jewish personnel who died or received medals?
The name of the book is American Jews in World War II. And it's a 2-volume set. It was published in 1947 by the Jewish Welfare Board. It's been long out of print. But some libraries might still have it. Sometimes you can even find old beat up copies from among used book dealers, because they've been remaindered by libraries or thrown out. I will tell you that it's not 100% accurate. Just like Simon Wolf's book in 1895 was far from 100% accurate. This one is certainly better than in 1895, because Jewish Welfare Board had actually a similar way of keeping records. They had those cards, and they also used military records, and this was before the fire in St. Louis. However, there were many Jewish soldiers who served who were not registered with the Jewish Welfare Board, and military records didn't always get updated that quickly, and everything had to be updated by hand. So it's not uncommon to find a soldier listed in the book, but the listing might be somewhat incorrect in terms of the decorations that the soldier received. I've even found errors as to whether the soldier was dead or alive, because the soldier was killed. It's marked, it's noted as being killed in the book. I've found cases where soldiers were killed in action, but they're, according to the book, they're still alive. But despite the errors, it's still a very good reference work to consult.
Yeah, I grabbed my copy. I don't know if that's probably looks a little blurry, but I just grabbed it off my shelf while we were speaking. And I was very interested to see you in the presentation, you put up the guidance from the Bureau of Jewish War Records saying, don't just rely on a Jewish name, right. Which, talking about what you were just saying, that there's a lot of errors. Sometimes I have seen a couple people incorrectly identified as Jewish, and I wondered if they did just that. But in comparison to Simon Wolf, to the Civil War veterans, they did a world better, and it seems that guidance at least came through mostly.
Yes, and the JWB had field workers all over the place. Plus, it was part, the Jewish Community Center, the YMHAs were part of the Jewish Welfare Board organization, and in communities around the country, when soldiers enlisted, the community knew about it. They found out about it, and the Jewish Welfare Board had better access to that information. There was no such organization in the 19th century to even collect that data. So we're already ahead of the game for World War II, even though there are still some inaccuracies.
Here's a question from Nelson Melitz, the current National Commander of Jewish War Veterans. Is there a comprehensive listing of Jewish military killed in World War I and World War II? And where is it located?
So for World War I, no. For World War II, the book that Mike just held up is the closest thing that you could come to. And so there are a few things that are problematic about the book. Number one is it's organized by state. So you have to know what state the person came from, or what state they enlisted from. So if they were from Massachusetts, you would go to Massachusetts, and then they're alphabetical. And then you would look for the soldier's name alphabetically. And if the soldier was killed in action, it's noted as such. And it also usually shows that the soldier received the Purple Heart, which is one of the awards that's mentioned, along with Bronze Star, Silver Star, and others as well. And there's an abbreviation key in the front that helps you to decipher what the abbreviations for the awards are. But those that were killed in action, there's I believe it's an asterisk next to their name. Those who were killed in the service but not in action have a different type of mark next to the name.
Mindy Reiser asks about JWV. Please talk about the evolution of the local associations of Jewish war veterans across the U.S. Are younger women involved? Women? What are some of the special areas of focus? I guess I'll address the question for today. Yes, there are some younger veterans involved, some women involved. You want to address a little bit of the evolution from the early days?
Yeah, I mean, that's easily the subject of another couple of lectures, but the Hebrew Union Veterans Association was organized in 1896, and it was never very large, never more than about 200 members, and it was only in New York City. After at the very close of the Spanish-American War in 1900, some Spanish-American War veterans organized. At first, they called themselves the Junior Hebrew Veterans, and then they called themselves the Hebrew Veterans of the War with Spain. They kind of lived in parallel to the Civil War veterans, who were an older generation. And then by the late 19-teens, both organizations were really starting to peter out. But after World War I, there was a huge influx of Jewish veterans, of course, because there were between 200 and 250,000 who had served. So a man named Maurice Simmons, who had been a Spanish-American War veteran and was a prominent New York City attorney and was very politically connected, he had been the national commander of the United Spanish War Veterans, which was the big secular organization of veterans of the Spanish-American War. And he decided in 1920, with a few other of his co-religionists, as they used to call themselves in New York City, to start something called the Hebrew Veterans of the Wars of the Republic, which would subsume these two previous organizations into it and market itself more to World War I veterans. And it did. And World War I veterans began joining, so that by 1922 or so, it already had several posts around New York City and in some other prominent cities on the East Coast. And then in 1924, it changed the name to the Jewish Veterans of the Wars of the Republic, no less unwieldy, but they switched from using the word Hebrew to using the word Jewish. The reason for this was that in the 19th century, Jew was often a pejorative term. Lots of Jewish organizations in the 19th century used the word Hebrew because even non-Jews could relate to the word Hebrew, the Hebrew, the majesty of the Hebrew from the old, what they thought of as the Old Testament of the Bible, King David, all. So that seemed to be a much more palatable way of calling yourself. But by the 1920s, I think the Jewish community was starting to own the word Jewish again, and so they changed it to Jewish Veterans of the Wars of the Republic. And then Jewish War Veterans in 1929. And then beginning in the 1930s, there were individual departments founded in specific states, mainly New York and Pennsylvania and New Jersey and Connecticut and Rhode Island. And the organization began to spread. And of course, World War II then exponentially added larger numbers of Jewish veterans to the ranks of the organization.
And maybe I will unfairly put Nelson Melitz on the spot. Nelson, if you're there, do you want to address the question today about young veterans and Jewish and women veterans and JWV in 2023?
Well, can you hear me okay, Mike?
Yeah, we can hear you.
Good. And thank you for putting me on the spot. I'll remember this when I see you next week or the week after. Okay. No, it's my pleasure to speak to this issue. We actually have quite a few initiatives going on. We have concentrated on going to the military academies, and we've made recruiting efforts there because we think they'll be one of the major sources for recruiting other veterans, of the younger people going into the military. We've recruited at various chaplain services. We've gone to the Olive Institute. I'm going to the Jewish Welfare Board seminar that's taking place in Miami next month on the 8th. But we've made considerable efforts actually reaching out to the younger people. And there's a considerable number of younger people. I'm not saying let's disregard the older people, but the younger ones are those individuals that are carry us on for another 30, 40, 50 years. If anybody has any ideas about how to recruit, how to actually retain people, please contact me through National, and I'd be happy to talk to you about it. Thank you.
Thanks, Nelson. Let's see here. We have a question from Alice Levy. Were Jewish immigrants to the U.S. allowed to serve in the military during World War II if they were not citizens?
The answer is yes, they were. And in fact, serving in the military could provide a path to citizenship that's sometimes a little quicker and easier than the normal naturalization process. And there were a considerable number of immigrants, Jewish immigrants, who served during World War I. There was a very large percentage, but during World War II as well. There was a significant number of Jewish personnel who had been born overseas and who had come to the United States as children. But I wouldn't want to answer this question without mentioning that many of you are probably familiar, or you know something about, because you've either seen the documentary or read one of the two books that have been published about the Ritchie boys, many of whom, about half of whom, were Jewish refugees from Germany and Austria who had arrived here as teenagers or young men in the 1930s, fleeing from Nazi Germany, and who either were drafted or enlisted during World War II, and who were specially trained as intelligence soldiers. Not all officers, some enlisted, but it's important to remember that many Jewish refugees who arrived in the 1930s did not serve in that capacity. Some were even sent to the Pacific Theater. And someone once asked me, why would the Army send a German Jew to the Pacific Theater when he could be so useful to them in the European theater? And frankly, I don't have an answer for that.
It seems like there was a little more of that very early in the war, when the enemy alien status was the dominant thought. And they get around pretty quickly to recognizing the valuable intelligence assets these guys are.
Right. Well, they didn't really start to organize them until 1943 or so. But so some who had been drafted or who had enlisted a little bit earlier ended up elsewhere. But I knew German Jewish veterans who didn't enter the Army until 1944, who were still sent to the Pacific, or to CBI, or to the Panama Canal Zone, or places where But suffice it to say that the contribution of many of those German and Austrian Jewish refugees to the intelligence services in Europe was incalculable, because of their facility with the language and with the culture, and their ability to extract information from German POWs about their positions. And also, when the war ended, many of them were instrumental in arresting Nazi war criminals and making sure that they were prosecuted.
Here's one, maybe a little more for your rabbi hat than historian hat. From Catherine Moore, we are mixed faith. Where can we put our loved ones?
I don't quite understand the question about.
I think for burial.
For burial. Well, military cemeteries do not discriminate, or they welcome anybody who's a veteran of any faith. But if you're a Jewish veteran, of course, you can request, and you are given a Jewish marker. But there are no military cemeteries that have a specifically Jewish section. So Jews and non-Jews are buried, all mixed together. If for some people that's acceptable, for many Jews that's not, because they want to be buried in a specifically Jewish cemetery. But military cemeteries are officially non-sectarian, but they honor and recognize the religious faith of the individuals, veterans who are buried there, if they choose that designation.
Barry Lashinsky with a 2-point, just a point and a question. Francis Slanger plaque is dedicated and well mounted at the State House in the Capitol building in Boston. And they asked about the stats you put up on the slides for World War II on slide 4. Are there similar stats for other wars, Civil War, World War I, Korean War, etc.?
Yes, there are. Um, if you want to email me, if you put my email up there, I can point you in some directions.
Yeah, we'll send a follow-up email to everyone who registered for this, and we'll
Yeah,
include
you
the
could do that as
email
well.
addresses.
Yeah.
And we are recording this as well for people that are asking that. So we will send out a link to the recording, and we'll include the information to get in touch with Rabbi Topek.
Great. I'm happy to answer any questions by email and point you in the direction of resources.
An anonymous question: of the 550,000 Jews who served in World War II, how many are still alive? And has there been any attempt to record their oral history while there is still some time?
I don't know the statistics of how many are alive. I know that that of the 13 million Americans who served in World War in World War II, there are probably less than 1 million still living. It's pretty easy from the Department of Veterans Affairs to get that information. A few years ago, I know that they were saying that 1,000 World War II veterans were dying every single day. It might be less than that now, because now the youngest World War II veterans are about 96 or 97. That's if they went into the service in 1945 at the age of 18, or maybe it's 17. So they are all quite elderly, those who are still living. The National Archives has done a great job of doing World War II oral histories, veteran oral histories. And there are other universities and other archives that have also done that. I don't know whether the Jewish War Veterans has any type of oral history or archival project like that, but they may. And so, yes, it is possible sometimes to find in general World War II oral history archives those that also include Jewish soldiers as well. One other thing I would mention is that quite a number of Jewish veterans published books about their experiences after the war. That's actually another one of my long-term projects. I actually gave a talk on this back in November of how Jews saw themselves during the war and how they expressed that. There were a number of these books that were published in the years after the war, some only a few years ago when the veterans were already in their 80s or 90s. I must own about 30 of them myself. And probably the museum has a few of these also. From the standpoint of a historian, you can't always rely on a memoir or a collection of letters or something like that, because the stories people tell about themselves are not always completely accurate. But it's still interesting to read their story about themselves, because it tells you something about the way they perceived their experience. And some of them are very, very instructive about that. And they really are the equivalent of an oral history about that person's experience in the war. So that's an important resource that's out there that has not really been organized by anyone or even written about in, I'm starting to do a little bit of that, but written about it in any kind of systemic way to try to examine it as a body of literature. But it is a body of literature, and it's a very interesting one. And I do read these books, and I can tell you that it's kind of like the way some veterans describe combat: months and months of boredom punctuated by moments of sheer terror. Some of these books are pages and pages of boredom, but they're punctuated occasionally by really, really interesting information, some of which is about the soldier's identity as a Jew.
Yeah, and then on the back to specifically the oral history question, so we do continue to collect some, nothing in a systematic way trying to identify every Jewish World War II veteran, but we do continue to get some, and we really encourage, because we limited resources to go out and do it with our staff, very limited resources. We absolutely encourage people to do it themselves. If there's people in your community that you think may have never been interviewed, or even if they have been, go out and do it, make sure and send us a copy, or just let us know where it's at. I think that's really important that people go out and get as much as they can and make it a community effort, because it's is not going to be one systematic way to get everyone. And with that, we're just about out of time. You want to finish with any last words, Rabbi Topek?
Well, I want to thank you again for inviting me to do this, and I want to thank all of you who came on today for participating. And if you got my email or you want to get it from Mike, I'm always delighted to answer questions by email, point you in the direction of resources. Jewish participation in World War II, what we talked about today, the memorialization of the soldiers who were killed, is really one little small piece of that larger story. And it's one that has gotten some attention from historians and scholars. I would recommend to you Deborah Dash Moore's book, GI Jews. If you haven't read it, it's a wonderful book. There also was a wonderful exhibit done at the Holocaust Memorial Museum in New York City, Museum of Jewish Heritage in Battery Park, about 15 years ago, called Ours to Fight For. And they published a wonderful book that accompanied the exhibit, which is full of photographs, but also a lot of personal histories and reminiscences and recollections. And the title of the exhibit, Ours to Fight For, indicates, it was chosen to indicate the attitude that a lot of American Jews had about participating in World War II. And that is, they felt a very personal call to serve because they felt that the Jews had a real stake in defeating the Nazis. They were not unaware of what the Nazis were doing to Jews in Europe. And many young Jewish men felt like they wanted to be part of the solution to that problem. And therefore they enlisted, or if they were drafted, they willingly served. And many of the books and the memoirs and the letters and things that generation left behind talks about how they were proud to serve as Jews, and that they were proud to be fighting the Nazis, and that moreover, they wanted the Nazis to know that there was a Jew at the other end of that gun or that bomb or whatever it is that was being fired at them. And they often said that in their 18, 19, 20, 21-year-old voices. And it's very revealing to see how that generation felt about going to war. Very different from what many of us think of now as participating in wars or in combat. But that's a very, very important part of that story of American Jewish participation in World War II.
Hey, thank you so much for doing this. So we do expect to have Rabbi Topek back for one or more of these sometime in the future. We'll let everybody know. Thanks to everybody for being on. Yeah, and we will send out a follow-up email with all the information. And have a good night.
Thank you.